This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Peter Lyon Memorial Lecture, which is being given by my former colleague in the House of Commons, Frank Field. Frank Field was one of those Labour MPs when I first joined the House who made you realise straight away that it was worthwhile talking and getting to know the opposition just as much as it was worthwhile getting to know your own side. And if we ever conspired to form a political party together, there would only really be one serious argument, and that would be who should sit on the left and who should sit on the right. But Frank, of course, his expertise has been recognised by Prime Ministers on both sides of the House, who always find ways to give him really meaningful things to do, although there have been moments when the reports sit on top of the shelf and gather dust. I understand, a little bird tells me, that 2 days before Margaret Thatcher resigned, Frank got himself into Downing Street and said to the former Prime Minister that, not quite these words, "Your time is up, Margaret." And she obviously must have looked a bit startled. He said, "Look, go now and throw the baton to John Major." I don't know if this is true, but apparently you were smuggled out the back door of Downing Street afterwards. So you never know where Frank is going to be. And he suddenly popped up the other day, I'm delighted to say. He was elected a member of the Round Table, the Commonwealth Journal of International Affairs, which is why I'm doubly delighted. I'm the treasurer. Unfortunately, Stuart Mole, the chair, couldn't be here today because he's got a family engagement, but I'm absolutely delighted to introduce to you, although he needs no introduction, Frank Field, who's going to tell us, can the Commonwealth ever become relevant again?
Right, thank you. Well, the answer is yes. Now let me spend some time, if I may, trying to convince any of you who need convincing that is the proper answer. And when you are judging that, you neither have to sit on my left or on my right. But today's lecture is about a memorial lecture about Peter Lyons, who I did not know, but to whom the Commonwealth owes a debt, as it does to countless other people who chose careers through which they could actually extend their idealism and play a useful part in their local and family communities, such as earning a wage packet on the way. So in a way, this is a tribute to Peter, in that, though I never knew him, for what I do know about him, it is here are, I hope, aspects of which he would approve, others he might well strongly disagree with, but would be worthy of debate. And there are three parts to what I wish to say this evening. The first is to depress you a little, but only briefly, to talk about the real dangers to the Commonwealth, which are now largely self-inflicted. Secondly, for us to guard against the British disease of disregarding some of our greatest successes all too easily. But mainly, thirdly, in memory of Peter Lyons, how do we get onto the front foot in a way which doesn't simply engage us, but might well engage large numbers of the Commonwealth? So the real danger, which is this self-induced defeatism that we have. Secondly, guarding against the British disease, how casually we've had huge numbers of firsts, like the World Wide Web, antibiotics, DNA, nuclear power, computers, some of those rightly given to the world, but all of them, and so carelessly given, most of them. And my worry is that part of the British character, and if you can call it a disease, is that comment that Oscar Wilde penned towards his stay in Reading Jail, that mankind, but I think we could certainly say the British, have a propensity to kill the thing they most love. And thirdly, as I say, how do we get onto the a front foot, not in a way that engages us. It'd be good if it does that, and there'll be some success, of course, if that occurs. But it's important that it goes beyond these hallowed walls of Batman et al. That's been filmed here, who trod these boards before us. So that if one is successful, it's got to engage the Commonwealth. It's got to engage some of the poorest members of the country, of the Commonwealth, and some of the poorest countries within the Commonwealth. But let me look at these, first of all, these real or imaginary threats there are to the Commonwealth. And let me begin with some of the real threats there are. There is a winding down, a disinvestment of Commonwealth associations and societies. How we respond to that, I'm going to, I hope, remember to make some suggestions before the end of this address. But it is a real loss, and both physical assets are being dissipated, but perhaps much more important, the intellectual and spiritual capital that, in a sense, many of those buildings enshrined is actually being lost as well. So I regard that as a real loss. And if we look at the Royal Commonwealth Society, for example, I think it's a real loss of the way it's been constituted down and down and down. And therefore the role that it once played of having a clubhouse where people of varying backgrounds but linked but with a great passion for the Commonwealth might meet has now actually been lost. And what one needs to think is what's the role now of these bodies which have actually lost, dare I say it, their empires. The second worry is, of course, that one dismisses the Commonwealth, or it is dismissed by those who claim it was a historical accident anyway. And we've got these wonderful sort of great movements in history. And we were on a rising tide at one stage, and now, in fact, we're on the other side of that rising tide. I want to suggest to you this evening that while, of course, you might wish to interpret the build-up of the British Empire and its transition to the Commonwealth as merely one of these great, determined by these great forces of history, that doesn't mean to say that one doesn't actually try and draw from those periods of history and the results of that in as positive way as possible. So while those are real threats, the loss of much of our institutional structure, losing it, and there is some power to the argument, isn't there, about it's a historical accident anyway, and history is now going on its own way. There are others which are clearly less so clearly drawn as those two are, where threats are sadly beginning to take on a reality. If we now look at the numbers of heads of government who think it's really worth their effort in preparing for and going to and following up afterwards Commonwealth conferences, the number is on the decline. Now, of course, there can be reasons for that. There's a political reason. Demonstrations are actually being made, opinions actually being conveyed in different ways. But it cannot be good for an organisation which, if it is going to live, it won't live only by the leadership, but it won't live without that leadership. And I think the trends of the attendance at the Chobhams is a serious matter. Not deadly at the moment, but nevertheless serious. We've also got stalking around the idea that somehow it might have paid at one time to be a member of the Commonwealth, whether you're a country or as an individual, but that is become, or has become, increasingly and increasingly untrue. I want us to be in a position tonight to begin to challenge that, to show that the real reason why the Commonwealth hangs together is that none of these highfalutin reasons I've been thinking up and will be putting forward to you tonight. There's a wonderful, huge dose of self-interest. And we actually need to recognise the self-interest that is there and build on it. Altruism, fine. But you can't build world organisations, let alone sustain them, on altruism. They survive because in the long run it's in the members' interest that they should survive, and we should try and guarantee that that actually does survive. Equally worrying, however, is the position of Canada, who, under the guise of anger at parts of the Commonwealth, is now beginning a course of action which, if it continues, without the rest of us fully engaging with Canada, it will be highly destructive in the longer run. And I don't talk just because they're such good contributors to the national piggy bank for the Commonwealth, but it is serious when one of those countries who previously were the most loyal and most supportive and creative of members decides to cut its cloth and, to some extent, depart. And the last real imaginary threat there is, I list here for you because I think it tells us something about a state of mind. And that is, well, it would all be better, of course, and you can't expect too much, because look what's happening to the Secretariat's budget. And I don't for one moment wish to underplay how serious it is if a great world organisation is cash-strapped in the way the Secretariat is. But there are two ways, at least, of responding to being cash-strapped. One is to curl up and continue whinging. The other is actually to use it as a challenge. And whatever one says about the current Secretariat, many good things to be said, I am sure. Responding positively to challenges, to box one out of the corner of the ring, sadly at the moment is not one. Therefore, let me remind you of what I see as a more real picture of the Commonwealth and why it engages me, and why I jumped at the opportunity that Philip offered me to deliver this address this evening. I think we need to take a huge intake of breath as I start going through these, because they are so remarkable. The first is, I challenge anyone to cite an example of a larger free association of peoples and countries in the world that we actually see in the Commonwealth. And when we consider its roots in empire, and what is usually the results of empire, that extraordinary greatness becomes even more so. And while it used to be said, I think it now is properly said about the Commonwealth, that we do have this extraordinary collection, arrangement, affiliation of such diverse countries, but on which the sun never sets. There is no other organisation in the world of which that can be said. It's an organisation that has a quarter of the world's population. We aren't talking about a few people here or there. We're actually talking about a very, very, very substantial part of humanity that is currently alive on our planet today. We're talking about a quarter of the world's population, which populates every continent of our world. We have countries joining that Commonwealth, which are of every size, from our smallest members, around 10,000, over to India, with 1.2 billion people. Again, extraordinary challenge, but an extraordinary bond as well, that people, not only of such diverse races and in different places of the world, can actually make and keep bonds when one country could easily just step on you and forget about your very existence. And then perhaps if we look at world politics, an even more important part, though all those are political enough, aren't they? Because they're great questions of trade and food and water there, that we have actually within the Commonwealth every religion. And as we're now going back into the age of fanaticism, it cannot be but a huge strength that those ideologies now, which are increasingly dividing people, are not so divisive within the Commonwealth that people believe they've got to have a Muslim Commonwealth or a Hindu Commonwealth or a Christian Commonwealth, or leave because of the other members of the Commonwealth. They remain members. And again, it's one of these huge assets which lie there ready to be developed. That's not all for the intake of breath that I've invited you to give. I mean, the Commonwealth is growing in a way that the world is growing. The Commonwealth is similar to the world in that most of the world is now young, and most of the Commonwealth is young. We've got a real concern here of the leaders of the Commonwealth, who still, maybe not in the right numbers, want to turn up. But what we've got to understand as supporters of the Commonwealth, when you're a leader of a country, I imagine you're quite busy, or you ought to be busy if you're doing your job properly. And the idea that you can also take on organising the Commonwealth just ain't going to happen. And that's why, when I come on in a moment, where do we look for a new leadership, of which those political leaders around the world will genuinely and immediately sympathise with and support? Part of it, of course, is going to come from these two other factors, which are these extraordinary characteristics of the Commonwealth. Partly because of its origins in whatever Britain did do. We do have countries that are also linked, not just by blood, not just by art, not just by culture, not just by technology, but all of these things. And it does put us in an extraordinarily strong position over those trading blocs which do not share those attributes. Now, it has been estimated by some, the amount of reading I've done has never suggested where the footnote is for this, but no doubt we'll find out where it is later. But it might actually cut costs of trading within Commonwealth countries by 10 to 15%. And if we build on that, the really important work that David Howell is doing in his role, really, of somebody who has real sensitivity about this issue and is a seasoned politician, that in fact, when one looks about the world over the next 10, 20, 30 years, lots of those strengths which I've tried to list here as Commonwealth strengths are going to be strengths which grow. And if you take the analogy that David takes, which many of you take, and many others as well take, that this is we're talking about an extraordinary family, then the march of technology, as David describes it, about how it decentralizes decisions, how it empowers individuals to increasingly make decisions affecting their own lives, their companies' lives, their locality and countries' lives, then in fact that family aspect of the Commonwealth can only grow. So I hope by now the sort of pessimism that one actually had at the very beginning of this, if anyone shared those pessimism, is now truly fading. But nevertheless, there are two other substantial advantages, as I see it, not least some of those advantages to Great Britain. Because the Commonwealth is so great, so large, so present in most places of the world, it gives us a neighbour that we've adopted, which we wish to adopt. And one of the side effects, it seems to me, from the growth of great empires and power blocks is that sometimes one gets involved with the wrong power block, and it's quite difficult to actually disengage oneself. Not that one wants necessarily a total disengagement, but one does actually want a rebalancing. So if one thinks about Canada, Canada quite rightly, subconsciously, is all the time manoeuvring itself against its large neighbour. And one of the great attractions to Canada before, but less so now, but we must rebuild, is of course that we are a counterbalance, or could be an even greater counterbalance to the United States Similarly with us with Europe. I'm not one of those people who think we're going to leave Europe. I do think the arrangements need to be changed radically. I do not believe the Commonwealth offers us an alternative to Europe, but it does offer us another life stream that we've been foolishly turning our back upon. And just with Australia, though much more distant, with the fall of Singapore and so on, began to think who in the world is actually going to protect us from whom we see as our enemies, increasingly turned to the United States. Australia, again, sensibly has a view that it might be in their interests to have a counter-block within the Commonwealth. So that's, I think, another growth point of which will lead to greater stability, but will be reinvigorating the Commonwealth. And then lastly, this, in a sense, check sheet, audit of the Commonwealth. Who, if we were in this hall, if Lord Beveridge had allowed us in this hall 60 years ago, would actually have thought the Commonwealth or the Empire was capable of the adaptation we've witnessed through most of our lives. It is one of the most extraordinary things. One of the reasons why I'm so pleased to actually be asked to give this address, because I started thinking about, well, could one actually even begin to contemplate what might the next 60 years look like, given what we've actually managed to achieve over the past 60 years. Any organisation that actually has that ability to adapt itself and to grow in the way that the Commonwealth has from empire, I would have thought you'd be foolish not to put some money on a similar process of development in the next 60 years, particularly if we stop whinging about what's all wrong about the Commonwealth and start trying to build on its strength. Now, what I'd like to do now is to begin to talk about what that alternative actually might be. But I do wish, first of all, to begin to think what Britain's role in this might be. It ought to be sensitive because historically we've had this role as the centre of the empire. And I think we should be beginning now to begin seriously by what we do and what we say to negotiate a new role for ourselves within the Commonwealth. The 1931 Statute of Westminster still lays on the statute book. It talks about the British Commonwealth of Nations, a government that was serious in repositioning Britain within the Commonwealth. One of its many first moves would be to move that word British off the statute book. In other words, we would be actually asking the other members of the Commonwealth, could we actually join the club that you actually had to ask to join? And it might be one of the things where they begin to see that we are actually that we have significantly changed. Another way in which we would see a very significant change would be if we renamed our Foreign Office. Our main interests, as I see it in the world, are Commonwealth, Europe, and other foreign affairs. And I don't see why we don't actually rename our Foreign Office that, and not just settle with that change in name, to start to change who occupies what desks and how many desks within the Foreign Office to reflect those priorities. I mean, William Hague is often done over because he said he was going to put the big C back in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Well, he put it back. But if you only got 3 or 4 people in the Foreign Office working on the Commonwealth, no amount of your strumping around as Foreign Secretary saying I put the big C back is actually going to make much difference. If you don't draw your leadership of the Commonwealth, if your main ambassadors don't come from your junior desks, which are actually dealing with the Commonwealth countries, if the Permanent Secretary doesn't see, or 3 permanent secretaries' time, that their best route to the top is through the Commonwealth, we won't have actually made a difference. One's got to make a difference in the power structure in the Foreign Office. And that preeminent position that Europe used to hold, always as it will be important and present within the Foreign Office, we've got to see these young men and women who are going into the Foreign Office now to see that if they use their sharp elbows, it's to get into the Commonwealth areas which will advance their careers from where they can do good, rather than the reverse. And then I think, again, small issue, but it will tell everything. What's the point of putting the big C back in the Commonwealth when your Chancellor of the Exchequer, as was in last October, in New York for a finance ministers meeting, when at the same time there was a World Bank meeting with a large number of Commonwealth finance ministers, including the person who just failed to get the World Bank job. You can't even be bothered to put your nose inside the door, let alone actually making that one of the points of your visit there. Similarly, with Jeremy Hunt, what does it tell those Commonwealth health ministers who were in Geneva for one of their meetings when our Secretary of State for Health swans in and again doesn't even think it important enough to actually turn up and make some serious contributions there? And lastly, and the reason why they get away with it is, of course, the behaviour of the Prime Minister. I mean, it's a little exercise which I haven't completed, just going through recent Conservative election manifestos. It's amazing the numbers of manifestos in recent times that haven't even mentioned the Commonwealth. Obviously not the Empire, but not even the Commonwealth. And we had last December, a year ago, when we had some senior education ministers from Commonwealth countries here in London who wished to report back to the Prime Minister, who'd managed to swank himself off running some important international job on education development. They actually wanted to report to him. Not only he couldn't find the time, not a single minister could actually be dug out to actually help them and meet them and listen to them and let them see that what they're actually wishing to do had been taken seriously and would be followed through and reported back at other Commonwealth meetings. So, enough of the groaning, on to the action plan, if I may. I've got a large number. I'm sorry it sounds like a shopping list, so you can pick and choose the ones you like, pull them around when we have a debate. But these are some of the ideas that I would hope we can, amongst ourselves and amongst our friends, begin to give legs. First of all, Europe is egocentric at the moment about human rights, and who shouldn't be concerned about human rights, particularly in Europe, given all the terrible things we've done over the past century, particularly the last 3/4 of a century. But is that necessarily the best way to shove views down the throats of every Commonwealth leader? Might we not make more progress on human rights if we could persuade countries that it is actually by developing their human rights, their rule of law, their belief about contract, that they will actually up the stakes as far as inward investment comes? And that our best route, it won't automatically happen, but our best routes to further the quite proper Western obsession with human rights is actually to see it in development terms, where people can see that it'll be putting more food on the plates of very poor people, and we'll get more food and more plates the more investors see this as a country with which they wish to deal. That's the first thing. Secondly, we ought to, those countries who ought to be more proud of our overseas aid than we are, we ought to gain amongst Commonwealth countries to see to what extent can that overseas aid both benefit Commonwealth countries and in a way which actually doesn't harm this country. I've never bought the line that one shouldn't actually have tied aid. But certainly you ought to have it tied increasingly to Commonwealth countries and with a good spin-off for this country as well. That's the second proposal. The third is now to start building up this self-interest again. I'll come back to the challenge about what's the Commonwealth worth to us in a moment. But it's not appalling, it's pathetic that here we've got one of the, if not the greatest organisation in the world, and we don't actually sit down and think about every single major position coming up within public bodies, within civil society like universities, to see whether we shouldn't actually try and get Commonwealth people into those positions. I mean, it's just child's play that somehow the talent that we have will naturally rise to the top. And the more we do this, the greater the success we have in this, the more people will actually think this Commonwealth Club is actually really rather a good idea, particularly if we don't actually limit it to the top table. Fourthly, we've got to take some risks. Why is it we don't even try to get a stance at the UN? Doesn't mean to say we can get a block on every vote, but are we so frightened of discussing our differences and views one with another that we can't begin to actually try and form Commonwealth alliances within the UN to actually pursue our given agenda? Again, with this whole issue of leadership, we have, thank goodness, got Malta coming up. There's this great, the sun will rise again on the Commonwealth, and we ought to be giving some thought to how we make the most of Malta's, I'm going too strong to say offer to host us, but they did formally offer, didn't they? And I think some of the Commonwealth leaders now should be encouraging the Maltese Prime Minister to be thinking very, very seriously about what we want from that meeting. We soon will have to choose a new Secretary General of the Commonwealth. I think it would be marvellous if the Prime Minister of Malta starts to set the terms. Not just the terms by inviting candidates to apply for this post, but for the Commonwealth leadership to begin to define what role do they want, how do they define this, see this job, and then that we begin to fill that post, not in regional Buggins terms, but by sheer merit. We've done enough of that. I can't think of a region that hasn't had its go at being Secretary General. And I do believe we should then, the world would begin to see that our transparency doesn't just extend to everybody else, but actually does matter in the very, very centre of our own dealings as the Commonwealth. If we scale back on William Hague's Big C campaign, I would want to see the Big C put into education, to further education and to higher education. I would have thought we would ought to make a major effort both in nurturing, extending, being careful with the lifeblood of the Commonwealth, which is our scholarship system, and begin to coordinate and seriously develop that, not with piles of money at first because it will be badly spent, but with getting an increasing hold on the aid budget, so that we can make sure that what probably for most people that think of the Commonwealth, other than in theory or from books, is that they feel part of it. They've moved about the Commonwealth. They've met other people from the Commonwealth. Their own lives have been changed by the Commonwealth. We've really got to seriously now think about how we make that as one of our major priorities. Similarly, because that will then lead to trade. There's no stomach, although there ought to be, but there isn't any stomach for having our own World Trade Organization. But that doesn't stop us, again, looking at how best we can begin to develop prosperous bilateral trade negotiations. So, for example, we look at the great mining companies in Africa and the role that they have played and will increasingly play now in Africa's growing prosperity, thank goodness. To what extent can we as the Commonwealth provide facilities where those trade ministers, where those home affairs ministers that might make decisions which are so crucial as to whether investment is sensible and whether it's going to stand up for 20 or more years, regularly meet. And again, I think we are brilliantly placed to play that role. I think similarly, we ought to be open about our membership. we've begun to extend it to beyond those who have had roots in the old empire, if I may call it that, in these halls. But I think we should make it not to let anybody in, but I think we should let it be known to the world we're open for business. And one of our requirements will be the way countries are run, and then the natural affinities they may have or would wish to have with other Commonwealth countries. I also think it's a very good way of, as we've seen, extending the European Union, of countries and cultures trying to grapple with something which to them was foreign in the way one wanted political arrangements to operate, and many of them making really brave stabs at doing so. And I think that's an immensely important way of encouraging that process in the world. And I think while there may be many wishing, there may be only few chosen, but we ought to make it a prize worth people having. Let me now just end on a couple of last points for an action plan which, in a sense, takes on the role that anti-apartheid did take on for the Commonwealth. And though with this wonderful success, it was a success that really is like the bee stinging you. The bee dies shortly afterwards. And we've not had any great moral issues with which to engage and enthuse the Commonwealth, and particularly the peoples of the Commonwealth. And I think we should actually be looking for those, not those which just simply are passing fancies, but ones which we attach real importance to, and which Commonwealth countries will begin to attach real importance to, because it affects them. And merely to say that does suggest, doesn't it, the ones which I think we ought to be looking at. One, climate change, and two, the unbelievable scourge of human slavery. Tim and I, as we were coming up here, we were trying to work out, Philip, how many graduates does the University of London have per year? And therefore, if we added them all together, how long would it take the graduates of the University of London to perhaps amount to 30 million people who are enslaved today? And we thought it would take the best part, not all, the best part of the Queen's reign, if we were adding up all the graduates from these great universities that group themselves in London, to make the numbers equal to those currently in slavery. And they are, of course, people who are not overwhelmingly, but are predominantly from Commonwealth countries. And therefore I hope that the bill that's now begun its process in Parliament will be a bill which is one which, the theme of which the Commonwealth wishes to take up and clasp and hug to itself closely. And while, of course, they'll have views about how that's implemented, we know that many of the supply routes for slavery in the West actually are, the origins are in Commonwealth countries. And therefore it needs to be one which with which all of us engage. There's no point us preaching in the West, yet again, about what everybody else should do. There's a job we've got to do. There's a job of us then trying to police those supply chains so that they're not staffed with slaves. And just as I think another move that Number 10 could make, again it shows the seriousness of this government, that I wrote quite some time ago to the Chancellor and suggested, now you've sacked your father-in-law, might you not give him the job as ambassador to the Commonwealth, just as Canada's got an ambassador to the Commonwealth. The letter is still to be answered, I'm afraid, which again says everything about somebody's priorities. I think it'd be really good if the Commonwealth countries similarly designated one of their high flyers as anti-slave commissioners, ambassadors, so that we would have a Commonwealth standing and group to actually drive this policy across boundaries. That's one of the suggestions I make. The second one is clearly about climate change. In that, if we go on as we are, whatever the cause of the warming of our territories, within 10, 20, 30 years' time, the Commonwealth will decline in numbers in the sense that some of the smaller states, the island states, will be underwater, so they actually won't exist. And therefore, if there's a topic which we should be world leaders on, as a group, the Commonwealth, it is surely this topic. And again, I put an advert in here for Cool Earth, which I am associated with. James Lovelock, the great environmentalist, at the end of his great, long, distinguished life, said it's all hopeless. The only thing we can do is sell up and give our money to Cool Earth to save the rainforest. Because we do know that rainforests, that's those which continue to exist, are not just the lungs of the world, but they're the great storage of heat, carbon. And as they are cut down, burnt and destroyed, that heat, carbon, is released back into the atmosphere. And while we may not yet or may never fully understand what the causes, the genesis of global warming, it does seem that our behaviour of emitting carbon cannot be a helpful factor in this. And therefore what I would love us to see, not only with this government initiative and NGO initiative on slavery, but similarly to have an initiative which links Commonwealth countries to defend the Commonwealth rainforest. And I hope we might begin to hear a little bit more of that from some of our Commonwealth leadership too, so that we begin to get a Commonwealth canopy around the world, where our rainforests are indeed up for sale, not to the palm olive manufacturers, but to other Commonwealth countries who wish to rent those rainforests to ensure their survival. Most of the Commonwealth countries who put money towards this in the World Bank, it's still in the World Bank. 1 or 2 trees have been saved. Quite a bit of money has been spent on seminars and conferences. It's about time we took some of that money out and started paying those Commonwealth countries, and they go around the globe, to actually keep their rainforest standing. It's more profitable to keep them standing than actually not to do so. The process, of course, of that movement, the Cool Earth model, is not one of just imposing it on people, but for the indigenous tribes themselves to opt for controlling their own forests, of being able to farm their own forest, to be able to sell from their own forest, so that at time it's not a rent payment that's needed, but that rent payments are made from other sources of the rainforest, and the rainforest survives, and because one, in the first instance anyway, has built a firewall against the loggers getting in to the main hearts of the forest. One saves, for every tree one saves, one's saving 10 from inside. So let me, if I may, just begin to draw this conclusion. You may be dismayed to know there's much else I haven't had time to talk to you about. I might well do, should you spark me with questions. But what I've tried to do this evening is 3 things. One is to suggest that sometimes it's so hurtful to accept reality that one, in a sense, self-harms. And therefore one exaggerates, one peddles to a high degree terrible things about the body you, or whatever it is, most love. And I think there's too much of that element in the Commonwealth debate today. And I hope I've countered that in 2 ways, in some small sense. One is how extraordinary the record of the Commonwealth is when we actually look at it. And why is it that we can't get this message across more fully? What do we do through our scholarships, through our schools, programs, all those things, to make that much more of a living reality? And then I do believe that if the Commonwealth is to survive these next 60 years and to be in, as it has over the past 60 years, got itself into even better shape, then we've actually got to think of practical things that are of real value to the Commonwealth, not just to the leadership, but to the members of the Commonwealth themselves. And once we start doing that, I think that our worry about the debate is then over. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. indeed. We have about 25 minutes for questions. I think I'm going to move around this microphone, otherwise the acoustics might be quite difficult for the questioners. There's a huge amount of knowledge and expertise in this room. But please do keep your questions and your points as brief as possible, because I think a lot of people want to step in. So no, please,
it's going to be a problem.
the floor is open. Who wants to go first? Yes, go.
You asked for brevity, Mr. Chairman, so that I will just confine myself to one question. Our speaker began by saying that the answer to the question which brought us here, can the Commonwealth ever regain its relevance, is yes. This implies that at one stage it had relevance and that lost it. If so, when did it lose it and how? Because until you answer those questions, you can't really begin to go on to answer the question how to regain it.
Thank you.
Well, I'm the last person to use this analogy, but if I was a marriage guidance counsellor, I think the answer would be most of the people I meet would find it very difficult to know when their marriage started to really become, to fall apart. But they're now before me because it has fallen apart. And I think the same really with the Commonwealth. I think there's an attitude that has grown up. But rather than me, let's have your answer. Please? Can we? It'd be really good for the discussion.
My answer is, the answer to the question is yes, because it never lost its relevance. And all the things that you've been saying in the last, and throughout your speech, are really amount to the way in which it has been relevant for the past 60 years. Your complaints are not against the structure or the evolution of or the idea of the Commonwealth, but simply you've been critical, with reason, of some aspects of its operating activities and some aspects of the attitudes of governments. Now, I think what your message is, and I think there's a real danger of a vicious circle, and we've got to turn it into a virtuous circle. And I think that is the message that I would draw from your speech, and which I must say I would be entirely in agreement.
I couldn't agree more with that. And I think the less we look in amongst ourselves and the more we look to do things, the better it will be.
Okay, Charles.
I admire the optimism that you've been giving off this evening and trying to share it. But if I can come down to one or two specifics. For example, you talked about the possibility of invigorating and developing trade within the Commonwealth. And I think I presume there was an assumption that Britain should be doing more about that. But isn't the reality that we're completely hamstrung because we don't actually have the power to take any meaningful initiatives on trade? It is entirely an EU competence, which we do not have. So I wonder how you think that particular bit of the action plan could actually be implemented.
Philip, shall I answer?
Yeah.
Or try and answer. If we actually look at the African mining companies, one of the things which they say restricts their development is the uncertainty of political developments. Therefore, one of the things they would most like is regular contact with those in government who actually will be making decisions which then can turn what was a profitable investment into a non-profitable investment. So they can at least caution against that, or hopefully in the longer run build such a relationship with countries that they begin to think naturally about the golden goose that's laying the golden eggs for them. I think that can be done within the Commonwealth with small beginnings. I don't think we'll certainly be finished if we wait for Europe. But I've been talking about some of these ideas now for a number of years. And a really proactive secretariat would have a whole sheet of these things that they would be actually trying to do, to actually engage. That we bring the mining, we meet the mining company owners and executives at set periods twice a year, and that we actually ensure that the ministerial teams that they want to meet are also here. So of course there's the problems about the sort of clanking way Europe will want to actually do the politics. But in this sort of basic way, which I think the Commonwealth, because people have got this association, they are not foreigners in any sense like that, we ought to capitalise, and we're not. I agree with you that we might well get onto a stage where we're being so successful that people read the Riot Act to us from Brussels. But there's so many moves we could actually be making now. I mean, I tried to get Gordon Brown to do this Commonwealth Rainforest. Another person who can't answer his correspondence. Instead of sticking 50 billion that was going into the rainforest over time, that we actually started using it to build up these great things in the world, and making it a great Commonwealth badge, that these would be world parks which the Commonwealth would be running, which indigenous people would be actually harvesting from. And I don't want to keep coming back, it's just a question of leadership, but it's quite hard to do it without that.
Patsy.
Yes, I would just like to continue what you said about lack of leadership in the Commonwealth. At the moment, the Secretariat is so weakened that even if heads of government, who, as you rightly explained, are losing interest because their meeting has been taken over and it's no longer, they don't get a chance to bond with each other, but that the Secretariat is losing 50 more people as we speak. It is going to have probably less than 200 people. It cannot do any of the things that we would all like to have done. For instance, you know that we did Ramphel Institute, the migration. We've been following that because that is something most governments are interested in. The movement of peoples is among the English-speaking world. Well, we did a paper for Colombo in which we recommended that they use the Asia-Pacific business card, starting with easing visa restrictions for business people and then perhaps officials and maybe students, who are vetted, etc. Although we had consulted British government, Canadian government, Australian, they said, fine, Australia is in the Asia-Pacific business card group. They tried to block it in Colombo, but we had also spoken to South Africa, Tanzania, Caribbean, and other, Bangladesh, so forth. Leaders agreed that the Secretariat should immediately follow up on it, maybe get even a group of heads to begin talking about how, because migration is very... Secretariat has told us there's no way they can start doing anything until later this year. That is 1 year after they have a mandate. Now, how are we going to get over that with this weak Secretariat?
Well, one way might be to... one of the suggestions I didn't make was actually, given the Palace's interest, massive interest in all of this, they might initiate about how we both spend our resources better, an inquiry, and secondly, how we might get countries to give people as well as money to the Secretariat, so that we're tied to actual programs. I also thought we should, again, looking at the role the universities could play. Why don't we have an inquiry from universities across the Commonwealth on what the real values of the Commonwealth are? But I do think, Nancy, that I sympathise with it that we haven't got the people to do it, but I just wonder whether some of the present people would do it even if they had the resources. And I just think we've got to get round them. And once you start getting round them, you create a different culture, a different atmosphere. You attract people who want to work for that organisation, who are not just pen pushers. They actually, we're in this world to change it for the better. And I think in that area, I was really happy to talk to you about that project. I would have thought we just then, in this interim, while we're waiting quotes for something to happen with the Secretariat, we looked at countries like Canada and so on to adopt them and run them themselves on behalf of the Commonwealth. And it may be a better way than just putting everything in the Secretariat. Though I want to make the plea, because Tim, who's worked with me on these ideas, is critical of me not being more sympathetic to the Secretariat. It is quite hard to, once a culture feels it's in decline, and you're seeing posts cut, colleagues leave, it's quite a job to get your enthusiasm level up in those circumstances. And therefore I wouldn't want to ask, say, Canada's help to do things in a way which undermined the Secretariat even further, but it could be a way in which Canada re-engaged with the Secretariat. But this, I think, last point, what it does do, it means why we need, the next Secretary General needs somebody with a set of qualities which are beyond those which we would wonderfully want from a diplomat.
Frank, you're striking many chords, and I'm not closing you down. I'm coming in to ask a question. But two of those chords, one I will just mention. The Commonwealth in Kampala produced the Lake Victoria Agreement on Climate Change. I'm sad to say that it's just sat on the shelf and gathered dust, which is a huge disappointment. But what I'd really like to ask you about is the Commonwealth Business Council. It has these wonderful meetings at Chogham's. We don't hear very much about it in between, but it's under new management and new leadership. Do you think, given support, perhaps a little bit more support from government, so the Commonwealth Business Council could be one of your agents for change?
Everything is possible now. It's just sometimes when you go and meet these, you think, wow, amazing, it's lasted so long. And I just again think it's a different approach. Going back to that other question I was saying about mining companies, I think we just want to get on and do some things rather than having big conferences with large numbers of people whose time is immensely valuable and who don't properly engage, but their diaries govern their lives in this way. I think on all of our moves now, and we should have a column which is outcome. What do we want from every bit of effort that we now put into the Commonwealth? What's going to be the outcome? Or are we just going to sort of motor happily to wherever these forces are actually taking us? And signing these there's no difficulty in signing climate change agreements or counter climate change agreements. And in my enthusiasm, I said billions rather than millions earlier on. But that's a small point. There are very, very large sums of money involved, locked up in the World Bank on these matters. And I just think you change the debate if we, for example, with Papua New Guinea, we said, we're really interested in you protecting your rainforests. Can we pay you on the world's behalf to do so? We believe in a very short period of time, given the development model we'd like you to consider, the tribes will become self-supporting, as Kula has shown this, fairly quickly. And Global Canopy's now got this marvellous technology. We can see whether you are protecting it or not at a drop of a lens, so to speak. I just think it would... that news about that gets another country involved. I know I spent all my life thinking passing resolutions and acts of parliament, all the rest are important. But there's no substitute now for actually getting some practical things which raise spirits. I think the age that we're going to save the world by having another climate change conference is long since. that train has long since departed.
Thank you for that very good talk. There's one thing that I think you only mentioned one word of it, and that was in answer to a question, and that was really to do with the royal family.
Yeah.
And it's a difficult area. I mean, obviously, the Queen sort of speaks as advised by her ministers. What about, because the Queen's not travelling as much now as before, but what about if the Queen were on a visit to a Commonwealth country where whatever was said would be on the advice of the ministers of that country and said something pretty radical about the Commonwealth?
Well, if she was allowed, let's say if she went to Nigeria, there are various things I would not want her to say on behalf of the Nigerian government. If she had a menu she could choose from, maybe. I did do a piece prior to the last Chobham, in which it was a sort of public plea to Prince Charles to ask in the sides of the conference to see what would be the response if the leadership of the Commonwealth, if they wished the leadership of the Commonwealth to jump a generation, and that it went to the Prince of, or Duke of Cambridge, isn't it, or Prince Harry. And I just think if we had a young royal family now that actually took on responsibilities in the Commonwealth, where countries wanted them to take responsibilities, their star quality is such that it would make a huge, huge difference. And also, I think if you look back on the present royal families, the Queen's children's generation, they might have been a lot happier had they had real jobs to do rather than waiting in line for a vacancy, which, please God, won't come for many a long year yet. I just think it would be terrific if they decided to raise their families in Commonwealth countries. It would give a whole new meaning. And it would give new meaning to the royal family. And it would meet our objective that they need to be slimlined. And this way they'd be doing it, but I think doing something incredibly useful.
Susan.
Thank you for a very interesting talk, much to think about. You've emphasised the need to do things, but do you think there might also be a bit of a superstructural problem in terms of you refer to the Commonwealth family, with which I'm sure we all agree, but there's a sense, especially in the way that Britain talks about the Commonwealth family, as if Britain is the mummy and daddy, so that we still, for example, have OBEs, Order of the British Empire. I mean, it just seems these things don't really fit together very well. And if members of the Commonwealth are equivalent, that rather raises questions about that.
Yeah, I agree. Again, it comes back to somebody. It wouldn't take that much effort to change all those categories. And why can't we have a Commonwealth Order of Merit, starting at the very top, to do this? I mean, other countries do have their own orders now, thank goodness. But again, there's real danger, isn't there, being British-centric in the whole of this argument. But we nevertheless do have a particular historical position. And it's not impossible, is it, to... as Jimmy Thomas said, if you can't ride two horses at once, Jimmy Thomas was the Labour trade union leader, you shouldn't be part of a circus. and being part of the Commonwealth is being part of a circus, isn't it? Where you may be required to ride more than two horses at once. And they're the qualities that we should actually look for. But I think it'd be refreshing, wouldn't it, to actually think and have a great public debate in the Commonwealth. What sort of recognitions do we wish to give? And what is the process by which those recognitions can be made? A real topic. And we might get some surprising results. But I doubt whether they'd come up with the status quo myself.
Anyone want to ask a final question? Tony.
Thank you very much. I thought the title of this address was pretty frightful. and very depressing, but I thought that the address itself was wonderful, and thank you very, very much indeed. I do think that it is very, very important indeed to make sure that the next Secretary-General addresses robustly the many problems that exist. I would just like to ask as a question precisely how we can go about, those of us who love the Commonwealth, in trying to ensure that there are really good candidates who can rise to the challenge, and the challenge is great.
It's a great question. We obviously want somebody to break the debate open, don't we? And I don't know who the sort of person might be.
Malcolm Fraser.
It could. I was actually just thinking of the Queen, actually. Whether she. Given the investment she's put into the Commonwealth, her Christmas broadcast is the only thing that ministers don't get their hands on. She keeps to herself, and she can be quite surprising in those. But it's just somebody to suggest, isn't it? A media magnet or something. And then start to actually get the interviews done on who these people should be, so that some of the politicians don't have to think too much on this and think, what a good idea this is. Shouldn't we be doing?
There's never been a process, but I understand that Prime Minister of Malta might be interested in trying to get a process going, and I think that'd be wonderful if he does take that sort of leadership.
Well, I suggested, Mark, that one of the things you might do is just invite other countries and peoples to define the job. Mm. And then we can start looking for the candidate when we've agreed on the job, rather than the other way around, that it's so-and-so's turn to have this.
Well, Frank, the current Secretary-General's tenure of office comes to an end in 2015, and there was a general election that year, so would you sort of think of...
Who is it?
16.
Yeah. Oh, 16. Really?
Yes.
Okay.
No, he got himself an extension, didn't he?
Right.
Again, on this business, you're not challenged.
Right.
It's a very... to who, again, the mechanics of it, who made that decision?
Oh.
There must be some...
John Major restricted it to 2 terms.
Yeah, well, thank God.
And so he's in his second
Yes,
term.
no, indeed, yeah.
There was once a contested second term, but it wasn't seriously contested. That was against McKinnon. Sri Lanka.
No, but if you take, again, an example of a ball-changing character is the Pope, isn't it? He was the runner-up. He was the again, I just think it's the power that leaders can actually have in making issues alive and run. He was the runner-up in the previous conclave and withdrew on the basis that they shouldn't spend too much time disputing who the leader might be. And maybe he was right to do so, but it would be a good prelude, wouldn't it, to have challenges so that one can see the mettle of the people who are beginning to get support, as he was, in that conclave. That's actually right.
A suggestion of a name to
Yes.
open the debate. What about Archbishop Tutu?
That would be fun.
Yes.
It would, wouldn't it? Power of the spirit as well as the world. Bless him. Yeah.
Okay, well, we will shortly move on to the informal part of our session tonight over drinks, which are at the back. I hope you'll stay and discuss some of these ideas amongst yourselves. The Peter Lyon Memorial Lecture we established 3 years ago now. It was in honour and in the memory of a very important member of this institution, Peter Lyon, who joined the Institute in 1969 and served in this role which was unusual now. It was called academic secretary. But in fact, he was there from 1969 until he retired in 1995, and I think Peter was, for many people, the public face of the Institute. He had the most extraordinary encyclopedic knowledge of the Commonwealth. He was the person you would always call up when an election or coup had taken place somewhere to get the background. But as a young scholar who met him as I was beginning my career, the other thing that he was just immensely kind and encouraging to young people who had an interest in the Commonwealth. He was editor of the Round Table for over 20 years and really put that journal back on its feet. Yeah, he saved it. So this is a very important event for us. We began 3 years ago with Lord Howell. We followed with William Roger Louis, the distinguished American historian. Last year we had Sir Ron Sanders. But I was absolutely delighted when Frank agreed to give this talk. When you think about members of Parliament since the war, really genuinely independent-minded people whose views are taken seriously in all parts of the House and beyond it. And it's a handful, and Frank is certainly one of them. So I really wanted to hear what he had to say about the Commonwealth, and I haven't been disappointed, and I don't think you have either. So let's thank him very warmly at the end of this thing.
Partly, but only partly because my eyes were giving out, the two things I wanted to ask Philip to do in counterbalancing tonight. One was, would it not be possible for the Institute to try and get the resources so that it could, with other Commonwealth countries, get the academic community to begin to measure what people see as the real value of the Commonwealth? And secondly, given the wonder of technology now, it is possible for everybody to get degrees to be validated at great universities like this university, and to see to what extent one can actually offer that opportunity to the Commonwealth, so it becomes another Commonwealth product, and therefore another great thing binding us together, of which then you've got a huge number of graduates marching in the footsteps of Lord Beveridge, being our champions, really.
Well, the University of London has this very proud tradition of its, of awarding degrees around the world, and it's something we continue with through our external program. And you think of some of the really successful and vibrant organisations within the Commonwealth, and I always think of the Association of Commonwealth Universities and the Commonwealth Scholarships Commission, who do a huge amount of good work and are very, very well led. So I think that is it should be a major focus.
But are your best lectures online for people to look for nothing? Yeah,
I mean, indeed we're putting, increasingly universities are putting resources online. And one of the things, just to say now, we are committed to digitising a lot of our materials here in the archives. We are Ruth's first digitisation process, digitising the papers of that great anti-apartheid activist, has been a major success and continues to develop. Our Commonwealth Oral History Project, which Sue Onslow is a principal researcher on, those transcripts, hopefully 60 or 70 of them, will be available online free for researchers around the world. But things like the British Documents on the End of Empire project, which was a sort of hard copy document editing process, that's my priority at the moment, to make them available digitally free of charge, so that the countries whose process of independence is recorded in those documents, that the people there, again, will have access to them free of charge.
One of the first books I read on Africa was Ruth's first book on Southern Africa. Yeah. Lovely. Her name comes up tonight, isn't it?
It's a lovely website.
No, great, thank you.
Good. Thank you, Pete. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. To drink.